Long before you or I was born, mythology and folklore tells us there existed a race of giants on this earth. These stories span the entire globe, being mentioned in all ancient religions and mythologies. Even some of the most remote regions, thought to have no contact with the Western world, tell us they lived alongside giant humans at one point. These writings and legends usually go back to a time before history, likely around the time at the end of the last ice age. A time when the last of the great megafauna still roam parts of North America, Siberia, Australia, and even into some other places. Giant sloths, massive lions, mammoths, mega-sized wolves, giant-sized deer, and many more megafauna still existed in this time of myth that ancient texts referred to. But what about the giant humans? Remnants of these humans exist in folklore all the way up until the medieval period, and some stories we find are even more recent. There are even small pockets of humans still alive today that grow 7, even almost 8 feet tall in some cases. But where did they acquire this gene for extreme growth? We're told that humans in antiquity were generally much shorter than we are today due to lack of nutrients, but this is a simple catch-all statement that can't be used to classify every single person and culture throughout history. This is one of many cop-out statements that the mainstream history uses to discount any remnants of giants that lived up until recent times. But what paleontologists point out, and what historians like to ignore, is that giant races of hominids existed, and we find evidence of that in the Denisovan specimens. These were a race of humans larger than Homo sapiens, likely ranging from 7 to 8 feet tall. But some say they could have been even taller. Only fragments of bones and teeth have been found, but from looking at these you can tell immediately they're from a huge creature way larger than us. This hominid was first discovered by a Buddhist monk who was meditating in a cave when he discovered a giant jawbone with a large tooth on it. We can also see that Neanderthals themselves had features of giants, and were on average slightly larger than modern humans, and we know both of these species and several more unknown species were interbreeding and living alongside modern humans. Many point to this as evidence of the origin of the giant gene, but to really understand who the giants were, we need to look at stories told to us by our ancestors. These stories are told by every culture from the Americas to Eastern Asia, down to Australia and Africa and beyond. Just look at this list of giants in mythology and folklore on Wikipedia. Most of these stories go back to a time even before our recognized history. They tell us the Mesopotamian civilizations began around 4500 BC, but these stories go back before that. The Sumerians themselves tell us of giant humans in their tablets, which contain the oldest known writings on Earth. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we're told he stood a massive 5.5 meters tall, and his partner Enkidu was around 8 feet tall. Gilgamesh was said to be descended from the Sumerian kings, who were also said to be giants and have extremely long lifespans. This coincides with the story of the Nephilim in early Hebrew texts, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants from the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were said to be descendants of fallen angels who impregnated human women, making them give birth to giant men who went on to be the kings of Earth, and were thought to be demigods and heroes. And it's said that many of our modern royal families are descended from them as well. In the Bible and the Sumerian tablets, we're told most of these titan creatures were wiped out in a massive worldwide flood and cataclysm, but many remnants still survived. And we can follow the stories and folklore to find the true whereabouts of these lost people and discover a bit more about who they were. In many of these stories we can find parallels and similarities that tell us what these giants were like and what kind of culture they had. Giants are usually depicted as very intelligent and sometimes enlightened people who can be vicious towards humans. Sometimes they're integrated into society as something normal, and sometimes entire societies of large humans existed in pockets around the world. They always built incredible structures and most likely understood technologies that other ancient cultures didn't, like advanced architecture and building techniques and things like timekeeping and the movements of the celestial bodies. They were also said to be experts in metallurgy, war tactics, magic, and even the use of the elements. Some were even said to have psychic abilities, and they were often recorded as being cannibals too. We find things like pyramids, cyclopean architecture, and massive walls incorporating rocks that weigh several tons that were said to have been built by these giants. So, after this massive worldwide cataclysm, we can follow the stories of giants to several places. In the Americas, we find stories from the Navajo and Hopi of the ant people who brought man beneath the earth into caves to survive this huge cataclysm. And we can find similar stories such as the Ojibwe origin story, where a massive flood destroys everything, leaving only small remnants of survivors. All across the Americas, we find these tales of giants. In South America, the pre-Incan people have the same story of emerging from caves, and in the southern region of the Andes and Patagonia, we have local stories of giants that used to live here. And early European explorers tell accounts of meeting humans twice the size of normal people. They recorded them as being 13 to 15 feet tall. The first mention of these people came from the voyage of Ferdinand Magellan and his crew, who claimed to have seen them while exploring the coastline of South America en route to the Maluku Islands in their circumnavigation of the world in 1520. Antonio Pigafetta, one of the expedition's few survivors and the chronicler of the expedition as well, wrote about their encountering with the natives twice a normal person's height. He wrote, "One day we suddenly saw a naked man of giant stature on the shore of the port, dancing, singing, and throwing dust on his head. The Captain General, Magellan, sent out one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same action as a sign of peace. Having done that, the man led the giant to an inlet where the Captain General was waiting. When the giant was in the Captain General's and our presence, he marveled greatly, and made signs with one finger raised upward, believing that we had come from the sky. He was so tall that we reached only to his waist, and he was well proportioned," they said. In 1579, on Francis Drake's ship, Francis Fletcher wrote about meeting a very tall Patagonian of 7'1". In the 1590s, Anthony Knivet claimed he had seen dead bodies 12 feet tall in Patagonia. Also in the 1590s, William Adams, an Englishman aboard the Netherlander ship rounding Terra del Fuego, recorded a violent encounter between his ship's crew and unnaturally tall natives. We also find stories of giants in North and Central America among the Mesoamerican people. The giants were said to have built the Great Pyramid at Cholula and Teotihuacan. Dating these sites is difficult, but many say they go back as far as 10,000 years, and as you can see, Cholula is buried under a huge amount of dirt, and Teotihuacan was when it was discovered as well. They said Cholula in its entirety is the largest pyramid on Earth, and Teotihuacan is not as tall, but it has a larger base than the Great Pyramid at Giza. Both these sites were built in perfect alignment with the stars. In Aztec mythology, they speak of a race called the Quinametzin, who populated the world during the previous era known as the Era of the Sun and Rain. They were punished by the gods because they didn't venerate them, and their peak civilization came to an end as a result of great calamities as punishment from the heavens for their grave sins. When the Spanish took over this area, they heard the stories of the giants that lived there before the Aztecs, and they claimed to have found entire skeletons of giant humans. Friar Andres de Olmos tells that in the palace of the first viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, bones of a human foot were found, where each toe measured almost the palm of a human hand. Modern historians discount this entirely as mistaken dinosaur bones, even though these bones have been lost to history and modern scientists haven't observed them at all. They just couldn't possibly have come from giant humans, even though that's what all the folklore mythologies tell us. In the very codices of the Aztec and the Olmec civilization, they speak of a race of giants. In the Codex Zumarraga, it explains that the giants were created by gods and then perished in the catastrophe of Atonatia, a supposed flood that reset the entire Mesoamerican world. In North America, there is no lack of giant stories. There's a major controversy among independent researchers over the cover-up of many of the skeletons found at mound sites across the United States. The Smithsonian cleans up any site deemed as having giant bones and locks them away from the public, and many articles exist from early American newspapers detailing accounts of giant bones being uncovered. Even Abraham Lincoln mentions the giants buried in the mounds across the land in one of his great speeches. These mounds, as they call them, were built by a people referred to as the Mississippian, a people many say showed similarities to their Mesoamerican cousins and most likely had a similar religion and culture based off of artifacts that have been found. I'm convinced that some of these mounds were massive pyramids at one point, or at least huge structures similar to the ziggurat we find on the other side of the world. A descendant of the Mississippian people, the Timucua Indians, existed during the time of the Spanish exploration, and their accounts tell of people 7 to 8 feet tall that had a strange and unique culture around the southeast region of the United States. These people also built mound structures and were possibly the oldest surviving remnants of the giants in the Americas. They were said to be around 7 feet tall, and some say they had pale white skin. This could mean they were a race of albino people or possibly even descendant of Europeans. They were said to be heavily tattooed, leading some to speculate if they were descended from the Celts or Picts, or possibly even the Norse. Although other sources claim they had darker skin, similar to other native tribes, so it's unclear. What we do know is they were much taller than the Spanish explorers, and they created many of the mound structures we see in Florida and Georgia. Many theorize that these giants of America were descendants of the Nephilim remnants, or possibly a previous unknown Atlantis-type civilization from before the Younger Dryas Ice Age and Flood. They could also be somehow linked to the Denisovan people of Eurasia from the time of the early hominids, or descended from some unknown hominid. We won't know until more research is done and more about the giants is uncovered, but what we do know is that our ancient ancestors lived along giants on these very shores in America. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll put a few videos in the description on giants that I enjoyed if you want to check those out. I also have a video on lost Mayan knowledge that most likely contain evidence of these giants, so click here to check that out. This has been Tales of the Old World. Thank you so much for watching.